Theatre of the United Kingdom plays an important part in British culture, and the countries that constitute the UK have had a vibrant tradition of theatre since the Renaissance, with roots going back beyond that background. Theatre was introduced from Europe to what is now the United Kingdom by the Romans, and auditoriums were constructed across the country for this purpose. By the medieval period, theatre had developed with the mummers plays, a form of early street theatre associated with the Morris dance, concentrating on themes such as St. George and the Dragon and Robin Hood. These were folk tales retelling old stories, and the actors travelled from town to town performing these for their audiences in return for money and hospitality. Medieval theatre. The medieval mystery plays and morality plays, which dealt with Christian themes, were performed at religious festivals. The most important work of literature surviving from the Middle Cornish period is an Ordinal Cernywach, a 9,000-line religious drama composed around the year 1400. The longest single surviving work of Cornish literature is Bywon's Mary Esek, a play dated 1504, but probably copied from an earlier manuscript. There are 4 complete or nearly complete extant English biblical collections of plays from the late medieval period. Although these collections are sometimes referred to as cycles, it is now believed that this term may attribute to these collections more coherence than they in fact possess. The most complete is the York cycle of 48 pageants. They were performed in the city of York, from the middle of the 14th century until 1569. There are also the Townley plays of 32 pageants, once thought to have been a true cycle of plays and most likely performed around the Feast of Corpus Christi, probably in the town of Wakefield, England during the late Middle Ages until 1576. The Luddice Coventry, now generally agreed to be a redacted compilation of at least 3 older, unrelated plays, and the Chester cycle of 24 pageants, now generally agreed to be an Elizabethan reconstruction of older medieval traditions. These biblical plays differ widely in content. Most contain episodes such as the fall of Lucifer, the creation and fall of man, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, Abraham and Isaac, the nativity, the raising of Lazarus, the passion, and the resurrection. Other pageants included the story of Moses, the procession of the prophets, Christ's baptism, the temptation in the wilderness, and the Assumption and coronation of the Virgin. In given cycles, the plays came to be sponsored by the newly emerging medieval craft guilds, having grown out of the religiously based mystery plays of the Middle Ages. The morality play is a genre of medieval and early Tudor theatrical entertainment, which represented a shift towards a more secular base for European theatre. In their own time, these plays were known as interludes, a broader term given to dramas with or without a moral theme. Morality plays are a type of allegory in which the protagonist is met by personifications of various moral attributes who try to prompt him to choose a godly life over one of evil. The plays were most popular in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. Renaissance theatre. The reign of Elizabeth I in the late 16th and early 17th century saw a flowering of the drama and all the arts. Perhaps the most famous playwright in the world, William Shakespeare, wrote around 40 plays that are still performed in theatres across the world to this day. They include tragedies, such as Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear, comedies, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream and Twelfth Night, and history plays, such as Henry IV, Part 1–2. The Elizabethan Age is sometimes nicknamed the Age of Shakespeare, for the amount of influence he held over the era. Other important Elizabethan and 17th-century playwrights include Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and John Webster. The English playwrights were intrigued by Italian model. A conspicuous community of Italian actors had settled in London. The linguist and lexicographer John Florio, whose father was Italian, was a royal language tutor at the court of James I, and a possible friend and influence on William Shakespeare, had brought much of the Italian language and culture to England. The earliest Elizabethan plays includes Gorboduc by Sackville and Norton and Thomas Kyd's revenge tragedy The Spanish Tragedy. The Spanish Tragedy, or Hieronymo is Mad Again, is an Elizabethan tragedy written by Thomas Kyd between 1582 and 1592. Highly popular and influential in its time, the Spanish tragedy established a new genre in English literature theatre, the revenge play or revenge tragedy. Its plot contains several violent murders and includes as one of its characters a personification of revenge. The Spanish tragedy was often referred to, or parodied, in works written by other Elizabethan playwrights, including William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and Christopher Marlowe. Many elements of the Spanish tragedy, such as the play within a play used to trap a murderer and a ghost intent on vengeance, appear in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Thomas Kyd is frequently proposed as the author of the hypothetical Hamlet that may have been one of Shakespeare's primary sources for Hamlet. George Chapman was a successful playwright who produced comedies, tragedies and court masques. David Lindsay's Pleasant Satire of the Three Estites is a surviving example of a Scots dramatic tradition in the period that has otherwise largely been lost. James Wedderburn is recorded as having written anti-Catholic tragedies and comedies in Scots around 1540 before being forced to flee into exile. Although the propaganda value of drama in the Scottish Reformation was important, the Kirk hardened its attitude to such public entertainments. In 1599 James VI had to intervene to overturn a prohibition on attending performances by a visiting theatre troupe from England. Scottish drama did not succeed in becoming a popular art form in the face of religious opposition and the absence of king and court after 1603. As with drama in England, only a small proportion of plays written and performed were actually published, and the smaller production in Scotland meant that a much less significant record of Scottish drama remains to us. The ribald verse play in Scots, Philetus, is known from an anonymous edition published in London in 1603. Drama in Wales as a literary tradition dates to morality plays from northeast Wales in the second half of the 15th century. The development of Renaissance theatre in England did not have great influence in Wales as the gentry found different forms of artistic patronage. One surviving example of Welsh literary drama is Troilus a Cresside, an anonymous adaptation from poems by Henry Zaun and Chaucer dating to around 1600. With no urban centres to compare to England to support regular stages, morality plays and interludes continued to circulate in inn-yard theatres and fairs, supplemented by visiting troupes performing English repertoire. Restoration theatre. During the interregnum 1642 to 1660, English theatres were kept closed by the Puritans for religious and ideological reasons. When the London theatres opened again with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, they flourished under the personal interest and support of Charles II. Wide and socially mixed audiences were attracted by topical writing and by the introduction of the first professional actresses. New genres of the Restoration were heroic drama, pathetic drama, and Restoration comedy. The Restoration plays that have best retained the interest of producers and audiences today are the comedies, such as William Wycherley's The Country Wife, The Rover by the first professional woman playwright, Aphra Behn, and John Vanbragh's The Relapse. Restoration comedy is famous or notorious for its sexual explicitness, a quality encouraged by Charles II personally and by the rakish aristocratic ethos of his court. Although documented history of Irish theatre began at least as early as 1601, the earliest Irish dramatists of note were William Congreve, author of The Way of the World, late Restoration playwright George Farquhar, the recruiting officer, as well as two of the most successful playwrights on the London stage in the 18th century, Oliver Goldsmith, She Stoops to Conquer, and Richard Brinsley Sheridan, The School for Scandal. Anglo-Irish drama in the 18th century also includes Charles Macklin and Arthur Murphy. Thomas Sitsurf was behind the establishment in Edinburgh of the first regular theatre in Scotland, and his 1667 play Taru Goes Wild, or The Coffee House, based on a Spanish play, was produced in London to amazement that a Scot could write such excellent English. Scottish poet John Ogilby, who was the first Irish master of the revels, had established the Werborough Street Theatre, the first theatre in Ireland, in the 1630s. It was closed by the Puritans in 1641. The restoration of the monarchy in Ireland enabled Ogilby to resume his position as master of the revels and open the first Theatre Royal in Dublin, in 1662 in Smock Alley. In 1662, Catherine Phillips went to Dublin where she completed a translation of Pierre Corneille's Pompey, produced with great success in 1663 in the Smock Alley Theatre, and printed in the same year both in Dublin and London. Although the women had translated or written dramas, her translation of Pompey broke new ground as the first rhymed version of a French tragedy in English and the first English play written by a woman to be performed on the professional stage. Aphra Behn was a prolific dramatist and one of the first English professional female writers. Her greatest dramatic success was The Rover. Theatre began to spread from the United Kingdom to the expanding British Empire. Farquhar's The Recruiting Officer was the first play to be staged in New York City on December 6, 1732. It was also the first play to be staged in the colony of New South Wales, which is now Australia. The age of Augustone drama was brought to an end by the censorship established by the Licensing Act 1737. After 1737, authors with strong political or philosophical points to make would no longer turn to the stage as their first hope of making a living, and novels began to have dramatic structures involving only normal human beings, as the stage was closed off for serious authors. Prior to the Licensing Act 1737, theatre was the first choice for most wits. After it, the novel was